For the first time in many decades, at the G20 summit, the world recognized an undeniable shift. The center of global power no longer rested in Washington. Leaders were no longer waiting for the United States to set the direction. Instead, the focus of the entire summit shifted toward Africa, where a strong spirit of self-determination is rising. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa served as the chair of this year's G20, but the figure who drew the most attention was Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré. Even without sitting in the central seats, his ideas appeared in almost every discussion on sovereignty and equality. And when Ramaphosa publicly aligned himself with Traoré's stance, the message became unmistakable. Africa is stepping into a new role on the global stage. From here, three major questions immediately emerged. Is Africa truly reshaping the G20? Is Ibrahim Traoré becoming the new voice of a world seeking self-determination? And how will the major powers react to this unexpected rise? If you want to discover the answers to these questions, please press like and continue following us for the developments ahead. From the moment President Cyril Ramaphosa took the podium, it became clear that this G20 would not wait for American approval. In fact, it would not even wait for the United States at all. Donald Trump, who declined to attend the summit, attempted to exert influence from afar. His administration worked behind the scenes, pressuring allies such as Argentina under President Javier Milei to block the G20 communique. The goal was simple: prevent any global agreement that did not reflect Washington's preferred language or political priorities. But Ramaphosa moved first, and he moved decisively. In a move that stunned diplomats, he opened the summit not with procedural remarks, not with the typical round of consultations, but with an announcement that the summit's final communique, the document the United States had tried to block, was already approved. Every member, he declared, had agreed. The room fell silent. For decades, the communique had been the closing act of the G20, negotiated under pressure, haggled over in late-night sessions, and often molded by American positions. This time, however, it was completed before the summit even started. To understand how such an unprecedented shift could occur, one must look beyond South Africa's procedural authority. The political climate had been shifting for months. Across Africa, especially in West Africa, President Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of bold, unapologetic independence. His speeches, widely circulated by Africa News and other regional outlets, confronted Western double standards, questioned global inequality, and called for a new era of multipolar cooperation. While Burkina Faso is not a G20 member, the ideological momentum that Traoré sparked across the continent elevated Africa's collective confidence. This is why Ramaphosa's move resonated so deeply. It reflected not only South Africa's will, but the rising expectation among African nations that the world's most important economic forum should no longer be dictated by a single superpower. There was a sense spoken in hallways and quietly acknowledged by diplomats that a leader like Ibrahim Traoré had emboldened emerging nations to stand taller, speak firmer, and reject old hierarchies. The communique that the United States opposed included several points Washington had long resisted: a strengthened commitment to global energy transition, efforts to address structural gender inequality, a reinforced pledge on climate responsibility, provisions emphasizing multilateral profit, decision-making rather than unilateral power. What made this even more consequential was that the communique included zero contributions from the United States. It was a statement drafted without American fingerprints. In years past, such a scenario would have been unthinkable. Yet Ramaphosa, with broad backing from the global South, pushed it through without hesitation. Argentina attempted to intervene on behalf of Donald Trump, but the effort failed almost immediately. With the document approved before debate even began, no procedural path remained to block it. Seasoned diplomats described it as one of the most striking examples of political maneuvering in G20 history. The message was unmistakable. The world could now move forward without waiting for Washington. For Burkina Faso, this was more than a diplomatic moment, it was validation. The political courage displayed by Ibrahim Traoré in recent years, championed across Africa News and other regional media, had helped create the cultural and ideological environment in which the global South could act with assertiveness at a major summit. His leadership style, young, unyielding, and fiercely protective of sovereignty, provided a new model for nations long overshadowed in global politics. And for the United States, this was a moment that could not be ignored. The summit had barely begun, and already a shift in global power was undeniable. But what followed next would do more than surprise Washington. It would challenge the structure of global politics itself. As the shock of the early approved communiqué settled across the summit hall, the political temperature began to rise. Delegates whispered, advisors exchanged uneasy glances, and analysts scrambled to understand what had just happened. The Global South had not merely asserted itself, it had outmaneuvered a world power before the meeting's first session had even begun. This moment marked the beginning of the summit's true turning point. The United States, watching from a distance, quickly realized its strategy was unraveling. Donald Trump had expected Argentina to act as a barrier, a last line of defense to prevent a document he opposed from passing. But instead of blocking anything, Argentina found itself isolated, unable to rally support even from nations that traditionally aligned with Washington. Meanwhile, the momentum behind South Africa grew stronger, and standing behind this momentum, spiritually and politically, was the wave of assertiveness rising from West Africa, where President Ibrahim Traoré had been reshaping the tone of African politics. Though Burkina Faso did not hold a formal seat at the G20 table, the influence of Traoré's message was unmistakable. His insistence on dignity, sovereignty, and freedom from external domination had become a unifying theme echoed across the continent. Across the corridors of the summit, officials spoke openly about the new Southern confidence. Africa News captured the mood, with headlines emphasizing the rise of leaders who no longer accepted the old hierarchy of global diplomacy. Traoré's rising popularity, especially among younger African nations, had set a cultural and political tone that many delegates carried into the summit. This rising confidence found its clearest expression in a crucial side meeting: the reconvening of the IPSA coalition, India, Brazil, and South Africa. For years, IPSA had been described as a dormant or symbolic alliance, but this year it became something else entirely: a strategic counterweight to Washington's unilateralism. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva both signaled support for Ramaphosa's leadership. They expressed a shared vision, one in which the Global South helped shape the world's agenda rather than simply reacting to the decisions of larger powers. Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré were not official members of this coalition, yet the spirit they represented infused the group with a renewed sense of mission. For the United States, this development was alarming. IPSA's revival meant the emergence of a coordinated political voice capable of disrupting the traditional dominance of the G7. Even more concerning was the fact that nations outside the formal coalition, such as Burkina Faso, were now moral anchors for this movement. Diplomats from Europe sensed the shift as well. Without the United States or China present, the summit's center of gravity naturally tilted toward leaders who had something to prove and something to build. Traoré's Burkina Faso had become one of the most cited examples of a nation refusing to be intimidated, and this narrative strengthened Ramaphosa's hand at every step. What made the situation even more remarkable was the humility and determination behind it. These were not nations seeking confrontation, they were seeking respect. They were demanding a seat in shaping the future, and for the first time, they were receiving it. By the second day of the summit, one conclusion had become impossible to deny. The Global South was no longer a background actor. It was now the protagonist. And the next confrontation, the one that would shock Washington most, was about to unfold in the most symbolic moment of the entire summit. The aftermath of the early communiqué and the sudden revival of the Global South's political voice did not end within the walls of the G20 summit. The consequences rippled outward into domestic politics, into diplomatic strategy, and into the public consciousness across multiple continents. What happened at the summit was not simply a procedural victory for South Africa. It was the beginning of a recalibration of global expectations. For the United States, the implications were unmistakably serious. Washington had long assumed that its absence could stall or derail major global agreements. But this time, the world moved forward without waiting. American analysts, observing from afar, expressed growing concern that the United States was losing the ability to shape consensus. The fact that Donald Trump attempted to influence the process through Argentina and failed reinforced the perception that U.S. influence had become more fragile than many in Washington were willing to admit. This moment also affected American voters. People across the United States, particularly those who follow international news closely, began questioning whether their country was still seen as a reliable leader. The symbolism was powerful. The world's largest economies, representing over 80% of global GDP, had effectively demonstrated that progress could occur without American approval. This stirred debates in American media about the future of diplomacy, and whether Washington needed to rethink its assumptions in a world that was increasingly multipolar. Meanwhile, the global South experienced a wave of renewed confidence. Across the continent, Africa News described the G20 summit as a moment of emancipation, especially for nations that had long felt sidelined in global governance. The moral influence of Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré became a focal point of public discourse. His speeches, emphasizing sovereignty and resistance to foreign domination, resonated well beyond West Africa. They aligned with the emotions felt by millions, the desire for dignity, control, and fairness on the world stage. For Burkina Faso itself, the summit brought a sudden surge of political visibility. Though it was not a G20 member, it was frequently mentioned in international commentary as a symbol of the rising global South. Citizens in Ouagadougou expressed pride in seeing their young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, referenced in the same discussions as presidents of major economies. His role as a moral compass for African autonomy elevated Burkina Faso to a status it had not held in decades. This increased visibility had practical implications. Nations across Africa and Latin America began seeking deeper partnerships with West African states, recognizing that the continent's assertive political voice was here to stay. Burkina Faso, often covered by Africa News and other outlets as a leading example of political self-determination, saw growing interest from countries looking for new alliances outside traditional Western channels. Europe reacted cautiously. While some European diplomats viewed the shift as an opportunity to strengthen ties with Africa under more balanced terms, others quietly worried that the continent's alignment was drifting away from Western influence. The revival of IPSA and the ideological energy supplied by leaders like Traoré suggested that future global deals might increasingly bypass Western preferences, but the most profound impact was emotional. Across Africa, people described the summit as a moment of collective dignity. The decision by South Africa, supported by the spirit of nations like Burkina Faso, showed everyday citizens that the era of quiet acceptance was over. A continent long overlooked had stepped forward with conviction. By the third day of the summit, it was clear. This was no longer merely a diplomatic event. It was a signal to the world that African agency had become irreversible. And then came the moment that would crystallize this new reality, a symbolic confrontation unlike anything the G20 had ever seen. From Washington to New Delhi, from Brasilia to Paris, the world watched the unfolding events of this year's G20 with growing attention, and in many capitals, with growing concern. What emerged at the summit was not simply a procedural upset or an unexpected show of defiance. It was a reconfiguration of who held moral authority in the 21st century. And for many analysts, that reconfiguration centered on South Africa's leadership and the symbolic force radiating from Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. In the United States, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some policymakers argued that Donald Trump's absence had weakened America's ability to shape outcomes. Others insisted the setback was temporary. But the more seasoned voices, former diplomats, intelligence officials, and scholars quietly acknowledged something far more concerning. The world had just demonstrated that the G20 could function, unify, and advance its agenda without American participation. In U.S. political circles, this realization was sobering. Media outlets across the United States began asking difficult questions. Has Washington lost its ability to rally allies? Is a new global majority forming outside the Western sphere? What does the rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré mean for American influence in Africa? Tueza. On talk shows and policy forums, experts pointed out that nations once described as developing were no longer waiting for permission to lead. They were setting the direction. This perception, echoed repeatedly in African news coverage, framed the summit not as a failure for the United States, but as an awakening for the global South. Elsewhere in the world, reactions followed similar lines. In Europe, the mood was mixed. While some European Union officials welcomed a stronger role for South Africa and a cooperative voice from emerging economies, others saw the summit as a troubling indicator that Western influence was waning. With Burkina Faso's assertive stance under Ibrahim Traoré gaining moral admiration across Africa, Europe recognized that old methods of influence, loans, diplomacy, security partnerships were no longer guarantees of loyalty. In Asia, the response was more analytical. India viewed the developments as an opening to strengthen its leadership among global South nations. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's close coordination with South Africa during the summit showed that New Delhi sought long-term alignment with Africa's rising political identity. Many analysts noted that India sees leaders like Ibrahim Traoré not as outliers, but as early representatives of a new generation of assertive African leadership. Brazil reacted in a similarly strategic tone. President Lula da Silva emphasized that the revival of IPSA, alongside the moral force brought by countries like Burkina Faso, could mark the beginning of a new, democratic multilateralism. In Latin America, commentators described the G20 summit as proof that the world was entering an era where the global South was no longer content to remain in the background. But the most profound global reaction came from Africa itself. Across dozens of countries, Africa News documented a surge of pride. Citizens and commentators alike saw the summit as a moment of collective affirmation, proof that when Africa stands firm, the world must listen. Ibrahim Traoré, though not present at the G20 podium, was invoked repeatedly as a symbol of this shift, the young leader, unafraid to challenge established powers, the voice that encouraged African nations to speak with dignity. By the close of the summit, a single truth had emerged. The G20 was no longer a stage dominated by superpowers. It had become a platform where emerging nations inspired by figures like Traoré could shape global outcomes. But the moment that would define this new era was still ahead. A diplomatic confrontation so symbolic, so unexpected, that it would send shockwaves through Washington and beyond. Just when the world believed the summit had reached its peak, when the communiqué had been approved, when the global South had asserted itself with rare clarity, a final moment arrived that would etch this G20 into diplomatic history. It was not a policy debate, nor a heated exchange, nor a surprise announcement. It was something far more symbolic. It was the gavel. In G20 tradition, the final act of the summit is the ceremonial passing of the gavel, a polished wooden hammer symbolizing not only the transfer of leadership, but the continuity of global cooperation. It is a gesture treated with deep respect, especially among nations that value protocol and heritage. The gavel is always handed directly to the leader of the next host country. This year, the next host was the United States, but Donald Trump was not present, and with that absence came what Washington assumed was a simple workaround. A junior U.S. official would approach the South African delegation to accept the gavel on the president's behalf. It was, in the eyes of the American team, a small detail, a matter of convenience. They expected it to be handled quietly, without fuss. But South Africa, emboldened by the new spirit of the global South, strengthened by a political climate shaped heavily by the assertive example of Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, had other ideas. When the U.S. request arrived, President Cyril Ramaphosa delivered a response so direct, so unprecedented, that it stunned diplomats. "No, we will not diminish the value of this ceremony." End quote. The South African delegation clarified further. If the United States wished to receive the gavel, an appropriate representative must come in person to the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. The message was unmistakable. The presidency of the G20 could not be treated as an afterthought. In diplomatic circles, this was equivalent to a thunderclap. Never before in G20 history had a host nation refused the ceremonial request of an incoming chair. Never before had the symbolic handover become a moment of geopolitical assertion. And never before had the United States, long accustomed to its privileges, been told that its absence had consequences. Within hours, the news spread across global media. Africa News framed the moment as a declaration of dignity. In Burkina Faso, commentators drew comparisons to President Ibrahim Traoré's uncompromising stance toward Western powers, a reminder that respect must be mutual, not assumed. Social media across West Africa buzzed with pride. Images of the Gavel circulated with captions praising nations that refused to bow. But this was more than symbolism. It was a test of hierarchy, and the hierarchy shifted. For decades, the United States had treated the G20 as a diplomatic stage where Washington determined the rules of engagement. But in this moment, the global South, represented by South Africa's authority and spiritually reinforced by the bold political energy of Burkina Faso, made it clear that those days were over. In Washington, the reaction was swift. Former diplomats called the incident embarrassing, avoidable, and a wake-up call. Others dismissed it as merely ceremonial. But the more thoughtful voices understood the deeper meaning. If the United States could not command respect in the realm of symbolism, then its influence in the realm of policy might be in even greater jeopardy. For the global South, however, the meaning was transformative. The refusal demonstrated that leadership was no longer about economic size or military power. It was about dignity, presence, and principle. South Africa's stance aligned perfectly with the message Ibrahim Traoré had championed across Burkina Faso and the broader African region. Sovereignty is not requested, it is asserted. By the end of the summit, one truth had crystallized. The gavel did not simply stay in South Africa's hands. It became the symbol of a world no longer willing to treat the United States as the inevitable center of global authority. And in that moment, the legacy of this G20 was sealed not by Washington, but by the rising voices of Africa. The G20 summit did not end with applause or elaborate ceremony, it ended with clarity. A clarity the world has not witnessed in many years. With only 3 decisive actions, South Africa reshaped the entire summit, approving the communiqué before debate began, strengthening the global South axis with India and Brazil, and firmly refusing to diminish the dignity of the gavel handover ceremony. And throughout every moment, the spirit of a new Africa, confident, principled, and unshaken, quietly stood in the background, embodied by the leadership style of Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré. For the first time, a young leader from West Africa became a symbol at a global summit without even having an official seat at the table. His unwavering stance on sovereignty, widely circulated across African news and throughout the continent, inspired a movement that is changing how the world views global South nations. And now, a question stands before all of us. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are achieving their goals? Or is it time for Africa and the world to expect even more from leaders who demand dignity? As the summit closes, one truth remains: a new chapter has begun. A chapter in which nations rise not because they ask for permission, but because they refuse to kneel. We do not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. Ibrahim Traoré. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than sensational headlines. And may Africa rise with dignity, with courage, and with its head held high.